Hello everybody, this is a little bit of a scary video. I wasn't going to do this, but it's been playing on my mind and I'm going to try and do it. If I just get lots of hate in the comments, then I'll take it off after a couple of days. But hopefully this is fine and I don't look like an idiot, nobody calls me an idiot, blah, 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 blah. So I'm in my 50s, I've been reading science fiction since I was very young and I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. And I'm not massively younger than the people that often put up science fiction booktube channels and talk about the early years of science fiction all the time. I don't really do that. When I was young, I've never really favoured the sort of the big three, the classic pioneers of science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. I've got respect for all three of them. I have some respect for Asimov for the ideas he had. Never liked his writing style, and I like obviously Clarke the most out of the three of them, but never been a huge fan of those three, but I get their importance. And when you look at people's list about the most influential, well, kind of like the most important, but the most influential people in science fiction, then you usually get Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. You get the people who ran their magazines like Hugo Gernsback and John W. Campbell. All that stuff is absolutely brilliant, makes perfect sense, and you get it a lot. Anyone that's interested in that kind of thing, you hear the same names come up a lot. Shawn, my friend Shawn, who I have a hell of a lot of respect for, and I like him a lot. He has done a brilliant video, well, two videos actually. He did a video like a day ago, and like recently he did a kind of a companion video as well, sort of saying a little bit more about his thoughts on the choices and some of his choices. Shawn is fantastic at doing this kind of thing. He's really interested in non-fiction books about science fiction and about the fiction, the development of science fiction. He's really interested. He's read tons of stuff about it. He can talk to you about real details about that, and it's always interesting listening to him talking about it. And we had a great, when I went to see him last year, we had a really cool chat about that kind of thing late at night. We were talking for hours. It was awesome. So this is a response video, but it's not a response video as in, what about this, what about that, because there's nothing wrong with what he said at all. And he's talking about really important catalysts from the past. I wanted to do a video because usually when you see this kind of video, you see the same names come up and you see like a cut-off point where people don't think anyone's influenced anyone anymore. And usually it's sometimes the 50s, sometimes people can go up to the 70s. This original list that Shawn was bouncing off was from 1984. So the summer 1984 is from a magazine called Thrust magazine. So that's a little later than what you often get with these things. And it was quite interesting, some of the things that were in there because of that. But it did prompt me to think that it seems odd to me that a lot of science fiction fans, and some people who call themselves experts as well, I won't name names, they say that nothing's been influential over the last 30, 40 years, which is completely crazy because it's just not possible. New authors come along that get into our psyche. They write popular books, and sometimes it's not so much that they're popular, because some popular authors aren't as influential, but they do write books that have a degree of popularity that means that they get spread about, and that a new take on what they've done becomes really influential. That just happens. So anybody who favours the really old stuff, I get that they might want to do videos about that old stuff and they might want to praise that old stuff. Absolutely. But it just seems odd to me that people are reluctant to talk about people that over the last sort of 20, 30 years that are influential and changing the genre or making a big difference in the genre, or creating a new voice in the genre. And literally, I mean, one of the booktubers I'm thinking of, they've got such a beef about one author, they don't even call them science fiction. So, you know, there is a thing, that's not Shawn. Shawn is Shawn does favourite old stuff. He'll say that himself lots of times. He does. He's not so keen on the new stuff. And I love the fact that when he talks about Star Wars, pause while I drink from my mug. When he talks about Star Wars, and he says he appreciates the influence, even though it took science fiction back 50 years. I love that. It's like, get that dig in there. And yeah, I know why he says it, because we've talked about it ourselves. Me and him have had chats about it, and I think we did a live stream where we were talking about it as well. I think one of the live streams we did together, we talked about that, and we also had a discussion about the term sci-fi, because for all intents and purposes, it's a shortened version of science fiction. But there was a few authors in the 60s, like Harlan Ellison being one of them, who I have respect for, but doesn't mean everything he says is right, who were really angry about the term sci-fi and thought it was dumbing down science fiction, which seemed to just completely miss the point that sci-fi already existed. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, which is a clear example of what they're talking about when they talk about pulpy sci-fi, had written well before they start worrying about this new thing that's come up. Star Wars made pulp science fiction popular again in the cinema, but it didn't stop hard science fiction being published. So that's another debate. But it is funny that Shawn clearly doesn't like Star Wars. I love it. So anyway, it was interesting that George Lucas was on the list. That was interesting, because usually people would focus on authors who were writing books. And to go into cinema and TV, then it gets well complicated, because there are some big names, some big changes happening in science fiction through TV and film, much more nowadays than there would have been in the 80s, because you could argue that as far as forms of entertainment and forms of receiving science fiction, TV and films and games are much more prevalent than books. You could argue that. I'm not going to argue that, but you could argue that. I haven't done the research, but you could argue that. I've done no research for this, by the way. Just to clarify this, one of the reasons why this might go down in a couple of days, if everyone hates it, I've done no research. But I am posing an important question, so I will get to the question in a moment. Just in a little bit of context for this video. So yeah, I think it's interesting that George Lucas is in there, but it does create new problems, because why the hell wasn't Rod Serling in there if they were mentioning Gene Roddenberry, quite rightly, and they were mentioning George Lucas as well. So clearly they missed the fact that Rod Serling had written a very unique way of telling a science fiction story that was, full of the unexplained, full of mystery, but also full of social commentary, but wrapped around a short story format that was often science fiction. Not always science fiction, sometimes it was just weird, but it's quite often science fiction. If you don't know what a Twilight Zone is, check out my videos on the Twilight Zone, because I've been doing an analysis of every episode. But anyway, blah, 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 blah. I wanted to talk about the fact that to influence people nowadays, you would have to, to influence the young, for example, which is what you're talking about. If you're talking about influencing people, you're talking about influencing the young people. So people from the teens to the 20s to the 30s, I imagine, because arguably people get set in their ways, and they're not going to get massively influenced by people when they're in their 60s or whatever. So, I think you could, and certainly new writers are going to get, you're more likely to get published if you're younger, I would have thought, if that's anything like the rest of the entertainment industry. So yeah, to influence the younger people, you would have to speak on their terms, in their tone, and with a modern edge. So for that reason, there have been some authors that have come about that have had an influence on science fiction, because they're doing that, because they've locked into the current discussions, the current social and political discourse, while also using science fiction as their vessel for discussing it. Interestingly, now it just occurred to me that I don't think in that list you had Ursula K. Le Guin mentioned, which was a bit odd. I don't think that she was mentioned, but she was doing that in the 60s, so well before 1984. But it could be that because it was only 10 people, and they were looking at people who had, if you like, created the infrastructure of science fiction. It could be that she wasn't mentioned because of that. But if you're going to talk about Michael Moorcock's relevance for creating the new wave science fiction, and people like Harlan Ellison and Samuel Delany as well, those kind of people, because Samuel Delany was extremely important from that perspective, then Ursula K. Le Guin should be in that conversation as well. But anyway, I've come up with 10 people that I think could be worth discussing as far as their importance, because it could be true that the people that absolutely love pre-50s or pre-60s, pre-70s science fiction, or older than that, would not have know these authors or not have read these authors. But there's definitely going to be some people who would say, oh yeah, that author, I can see why you've mentioned that author. They are important and have influenced people, blah, 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 blah. And there are some that have really new that I've kind of mentioned as well. There's, well, 2 in particular are very new, but I think they've already made a big difference to new people coming out and new people taking on that style and that mental and that focus that they've done. So I'll get there in a minute. But just a few obvious ones that I think most people would agree with, but haven't been mentioned in any of this. But that's partly because I think Sean's bouncing off a list from 1984. So, Philip K. Dick. It's not on the list. It could have been, because by 1984 he'd already written loads of stuff, and it seems odd, unless I missed it, which seems a bit odd. I don't think I missed it. Philip K. Dick should have been mentioned. He's hugely influential. He's got a very specific style that I don't think always works, but when it does work, it really works. And there are people that absolutely love what they do, what he does, and they get really obsessed with it. And great booktubers like Moyd do deep dives on Philip K. Dick, and you can really explore what he does because he's full of new ideas. And he has got a very specific way of writing, a very specific voice, which has had influence, huge influence. But yeah, nobody does it like he does in some ways, that kind of thing. So Philip K. Dick is hugely important. There's a couple here that, again, should be mentioned if you're talking about influential people, I think, and are from the sort of, I think they started in the 80s and 90s, I think. And that's Ian Banks. So Ian Banks, obviously, a Scottish writer who wrote non-science fiction as well as science fiction, but the Player of Games and what was the series called? I can't remember what series called, but that huge series of books he wrote with the Player of Games in it, and Consider Fleabess and all that stuff. I've got all of them, I think, but I haven't read any yet. I'm a little bit intimidated by them, to be honest. But once I've got an insane amount of headspace and I empty everything from my brain, I'll be a bit more confident about reading them. But Ian Banks, surely that's a big deal, because what he's written there has had a huge influence on hard science fiction and big ideas, and like the whole what you can do with a series. Equally, a lot of people who love Ian Banks love Alistair Reynolds. Alistair Reynolds is a Welsh science fiction writer that started around the same sort of time, I think, and wrote Revelation Space series. Again, I'm a little bit intimidated by his stuff, so I've got tons of his books, and I have read some of them, to be honest. I've read his trilogy that has been labelled as YA, but I didn't see it as YA. I thought I just didn't see the connection. Only the fact they were young protagonists. But yeah, I've read all 3 books with those, and I've read a short story book, and I read Permafrost, but I haven't read Revelation Space yet, and I'm going to read it this year, absolutely. But Alistair Reynolds is a big name, really influential, someone that a lot of people try and emulate. So yeah, that should be in the discussion as well. William Gibson, and again another one that created cyberpunk and hugely influential on the new wave and a new look at, if you're going to look at technology, then, that end of technology, the whole cyber world, AI, and the developments of computers, all that stuff, the artificial world, that starts with William Gibson and hugely influential. That goes without saying as well. So some of this is not, rocket science. And then there's Neil Stephenson. I thought Neil Stephenson was worth mentioning because of Snow Crash and a few of his other books that come up a lot. I imagine he's had an influence. But again, this is just a discussion piece. This is not me saying blah, 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 blah. This is just me imagining that surely these people have had an influence, that it's not just these people from 100 years ago that have had an influence. So Neil Stephenson as well. Cixin Liu. I hear about his books so often on YouTube. So often. People are always talking about Cixin Liu books. I've got The Three-Body Problem. Again, I've kind of put it off a little bit. And I don't know if it's my kind of science fiction, to be honest. But Cixin Liu is definitely influential because there are people that are being compared to him when their stuff comes out. And he has created this... it could be... I don't know if it's... You guys could tell me in the comment section if it's similar to Alistair Reynolds. I don't know if it is. But there are loads of people coming through to the US and the UK market that are from Japan and Korea and other Asian countries that kind of expand our reading, which is cool. But Cixin Liu is definitely the biggest one, I think. Yeah, Cixin Liu. Another one that I think doesn't get mentioned a lot because it's not hard science fiction at all. It's not particularly scientific, but it's definitely science fiction, and that's Douglas Adams. If you can accept Douglas Adams is able to be put in the list, I was thinking of another word, couldn't think of it. But if he's eligible for the list, if Douglas Adams, I have no notes. If Douglas Adams is eligible for the list, then he definitely has to be in it then if he's eligible, because every single book that comes out that has got some kind of comedic element and it's science fiction, there's a mention of Douglas Adams on the back. Every single one. It's like, just like Douglas Adams. This is Douglas Adams mixed with, have you read Douglas Adams? You like this? It's like, oh my God, everything is like Douglas Adams. But that's because he has influenced lots of writers. But even the people that haven't been influenced by him are going to be accused of being influenced by him because he's so... the Hitchhiker series was such a big deal. It's so different. And it was such a new way of writing about going on different planets and meeting these aliens and all that sort of stuff, So, it was purely for comedy effect. To be fair, he was making some social commentary as well, but ultimately it's a comedy. And it had a huge influence on me. I mean, my last novel is absolutely in the Hitchhiker's vein. Absolutely. If you like Hitchhikers, then go buy The Brown Yelp Gang. Anyway, so there's Douglas Adams. Why he's not in this, I don't know. But there we are. And I think, judging from if I quickly go down, I think there's 3 left. 3 left, yeah. I've written them in a funny order. So I haven't done this in an order, by the way. I'm just doing it as I do it. So, another one, Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler, I imagine you'd all agree is influential. Some of what Octavia Butler's written has been really... And Kindred is probably the one that gets talked about the most. But I think using science fiction to tell a story about race in that way, it's not that it hadn't been done before, but I think her voice has had an influence. I think. Don't kill me, I think. And then there's definitely 2 new ones that I definitely am very confident about saying they've had an influence. And to be fair, they were like the 2 I first thought of when I thought, what about now? And that's the author Nnedi Okorafor. And Nnedi Okorafor is definitely part of this Afrofuturism. Probably the most visible author. So usually when you go into the shop, you can see her books there. And Binti was the big book that kind of put a name out there, I think. But it seems like people are mentioning all sorts of books she's written that have been brilliant. I've only read Binti, really liked it. But the Afrofuturism is a big deal. It's a new voice in science fiction that wasn't as prevalent now. You know, if someone's going to tell me that someone wrote it before, yeah, okay, fine. But it's not. It wasn't like a movement, or it wasn't a big change like it has been recently, with lots of authors being championed and coming out and being more visible on the shelves. And Lady Okorafor is definitely one of them. So if you're going to tell me it's happened before, doesn't change my point. And then the other person is Becky Chambers. And Becky Chambers is massively having an influence, because there's lots of other people that are writing in that style, and no one really written like that before. I mean, I've been reading science fiction all my life, and her focus is quite unique, and people have, but because of that, it's a little bit Marmite. Some people say, "Oh, where's the story?" or "Where's the conflict?" or "Why am I reading this?" And there's other people that just absolutely love getting seeped into this thing that's not about conflict. It's not about a big intergalactic war, although sometimes the stories have got that in the background. And it's literally about characters. It's about exploring what would an alien be. So some of the characters in the book that kind of put a name on the map, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, some of those characters, their traits, their alien traits are really interesting. And she uses those to explore difference amongst this crew of this spaceship, and she does explore difference a lot. And I think some people don't like praising her if they're a little bit irritated by identity politics. But ultimately, what she's doing has had an influence. It's definitely creating this wish for some writers to write like her. I've seen books where they've mentioned her on the back, say, "Oh, this is just like Becky Chambers," or you see her name as a blurb writer on the back a lot of the time now. So that suggests that the influence is enough for people to value her opinion on the back of a book as well. All those kind of things. I think it's out of all of them, I think it's one of the things that she's got such a different way of looking at science fiction. The Wayfarer series in particular. I mean, the Monk and Robot series are quite different as well, to be fair. But yeah, the Wayfarer series have got so much science in them, as well as a really different approach to writing science fiction. So, there we are. 10 authors. You're all going to attack me in the comments. I'm going to regret doing this. But there we are. Maybe this will stay up. I hope it stays up. If in a year's time it's still up there, then you weren't too aggressive, which would be nice. Because some people get really, really passionate about this. But I just think, it does seem a bit weird that we're going to suggest that nobody's having an influence now and everyone's just writing the same old story over and over again. I just don't think that's true. But I just want to just end with this point, that if George Lucas was included in the 1984 thing that came up in Thrust magazine that Shawn brilliantly talked about, then nowadays, if we're looking at movies and TV shows and games, I think as well, because it could be The Last of Us by Neil Druckmann might be quite influential as well. But what I'm thinking is, should we now be praising Charlie Brooker for creating Black Mirror and some of the ways that Black Mirror develops that what if thing with technology in those stories, and literally Black Mirror is seen by everybody under 30, and all of my students talk about Black Mirror when it comes back up again. And they're all obsessed with it. And if I met any average 25-year-old and I asked them if they'd read any of these authors, the average person might say no. But if I said, "Have you seen Black Mirror?" they go, "Yeah, I have seen that." And it's huge. It's extreme. But obviously, I'm not just saying it's popular, because it's also it's created another way of doing television. Black Mirror is a modern version of The Twilight Zone. There's no doubt about that. And Charlie Brooker said he's influenced by The Twilight Zone. But it's still very different. And it still has a different way of doing it. Rod Serling would never do anything that in your face, that harsh, that uncomfortable to watch. He'd never do that. And it could be nature of the times. But even if it is, it's interesting to think about Charlie Brooker being influential as well, I think, for Black Mirror. So there we are. I'm going to nervously put this up, see what happens. Stay curious.